You think you know what it's like to be a king. Palaces, powers, silk robes, a crown glittering on your head. Armies marching at your command, lords and ladies bowing at your feet. Well, buckle up, because the king you're about to meet had none of that. In fact, for 6 desperate weeks, his entire kingdom was reduced to the branches of a single tree. This is the story of the most intense manhunt in British history. A young king, defeated, exhausted and alone, with a death sentence nailed to his name, and an entire nation hunting him like a stray dog. He couldn't call on his army. He couldn't even reveal his identity. His only weapons were dirt, disguise, and the terrifying art of becoming invisible. This isn't the history of dusty treaties and royal councils. This is the visceral, minute-by-minute story of survival that textbooks are too polite to tell you. When the Battle of Worcester ended in September 1651, Charles II wasn't a king, he was prey. The battlefield was chaos. Cromwell's disciplined new model army had ripped through the royalist forces like a blade through silk. Cannons thundered, cavalry charged, and by dusk, Charles's last army had been torn apart. Soldiers who had sworn to die for him were cut down in the mud, their loyalty no shield against Cromwell's iron rule.
Charles himself barely escaped. He was only 21, tall, commanding, yet painfully inexperienced. As the sun bled into the horizon, he galloped from the carnage, his horse pounding through the smoke and screams. By nightfall, he wasn't a monarch. He was a fugitive, and Cromwell made sure the entire country knew it. A reward of £1,000 was proclaimed. In today's money, that was enough to transform a poor farmer into a gentleman overnight. Suddenly, every peasant with a pitchfork was a bounty hunter. Every tavern gossip could be a spy. The rules were brutally simple. Shelter the king, and you die. Hand him over, and you get rich. Overnight, Charles wasn't a ruler, he was a prize, the ultimate quarry in a nationwide hunt. If he wanted to survive, Charles had to kill the king inside himself. That was easier said than done. He was 6'2", an absolute giant in the 17th century, where most men barely brushed 5.5 feet. He stood out in every crowd, his regal bearing practically announcing his identity. His first act of survival was humiliation. He forced himself to slouch, to hunch, to erase the proud carriage drilled into him since childhood. His long, flowing black hair, the same hair painted in royal portraits, was hacked away with farming shears. His delicate, unused hands were rubbed raw with mud until they looked like they belonged to a field laborer. Piece by painful piece, he shed his royalty. This wasn't disguise. This was dismemberment of identity. The opening day of his flight was a nightmare. He fled Worcester on horseback, but the animal was too obvious. A mounted man would draw suspicion. So with no choice, he abandoned his steed and took to his feet. Picture it. A man born to be carried in gilded carriages, now stumbling through dense, wet forests, his expensive leather shoes shredding on rocks and brambles. Palace records later noted his feet were blistered, and bleeding so badly that he left crimson stains along his path. Every step was agony. But worse than the pain was the paranoia. Every snapped twig was a soldier's footstep. Every rustle of wind was Cromwell's voice calling out for his capture. At one point, Charles and his dwindling band of companions were forced to dive into a ditch, covering themselves with leaves while a patrol marched past just yards away. Imagine the pounding of his heart, the sweat soaking his rags, the suffocating silence as men who wanted to hang him by dawn strode above his hiding place. This was no king, this was prey. And then came the moment that turned desperation into legend. With Cromwell's troops swarming the countryside, Charles was led to Boscobel, a small estate loyal to the royalist cause. But even here, soldiers searched every room, every barn, every scrap of land. There was nowhere left to hide. Nowhere. Except up, in the middle of a field stood a towering oak tree, its branches wide and heavy with leaves. In a last-ditch gamble, Charles and a single companion clambered into the canopy, pulling the thick foliage around them like a shroud. And then they waited. Hours dragged by, and then came the unthinkable. A squad of parliamentarian soldiers marched directly to the base of the tree. So close, Charles could have reached down and touched their helmets. He could hear every word of their laughter, every curse they muttered about the dog Charles Stuart. One even joked about what they'd do when they caught him, hang him from the nearest tree. The irony was suffocating. Charles held his breath until his chest screamed for air. His entire life, his bloodline, his destiny, his survival balanced on the thickness of a few oak leaves. The soldiers eventually moved on, never once suspecting that the prize they hunted was crouching silently above them, heart hammering, lungs burning. That tree would go down in history as the Royal Oak. But survival in a tree was not escape. To cross England, Charles needed more than luck. He needed a disguise so convincing it would defy the nation. Enter Jane Lane, a courageous royalist woman who risked her life to aid the king. To the world, Charles was now William Jackson, Jane's humble servant. The transformation was excruciating. He had to walk behind her, hold her horse, speak only when spoken to. Every instinct in his body screamed against this humiliation, yet he played the part with grim determination. At one blacksmith's, the horse lost a shoe. Charles, the servant, brought it in. As sparks flew from the anvil, the blacksmith began to rant about politics, spitting venom about the hated Charles Stuart and how he deserved to hang. And there stood Charles himself, nodding, agreeing, his face a mask of submission while inside his blood boiled. One slip of the tongue, and his head would be mounted on a pike. The tension only grew. At an inn, a soldier claimed to recognize him from the battlefield. Charles's heart must have stopped. But instead of calling the guards, the man quietly knelt in the stable, whispering his loyalty to the disguised king. Moments like this were maddening. Half the country wanted him dead. The other half worshipped him like a savior. And he never knew, from one breath to the next, which face belonged to which. After 6 weeks of this nerve-shredding ordeal, Charles reached the coast. He bribed a captain to take him to France aboard a small coal boat called the Surprise. But fate wasn't finished tormenting him. As they set sail, the tide betrayed them. The boat was dragged back toward the English shore, right into the path of Cromwell's patrols. For hours, they drifted helplessly, watching the enemy ships close in. Imagine surviving battlefields, bleeding forests, hiding in trees, only to be undone by the tide. And then salvation. A sudden wind filled the sails, carrying the little vessel out into the open sea. Charles later insisted it was an act of God. Whether miracle or luck, it saved him. On a cold October morning, Charles landed in France. A penniless king in rags, a monarch without a throne. But he had survived. And the legend of the oak tree would follow him forever, shaping the myth of the king who would one day return to reclaim his crown. Because absolute power means nothing when you're hiding for your life. Charles II's escape proves that sometimes the greatest weapon a king can wield isn't an army, but the will to vanish into the shadows. And if you find these forgotten, pulse-pounding corners of history fascinating, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Because the real stories of power, terror, and survival, they're far stranger than anything you've ever imagined.